Hello, everybody. Today, for me especially, it's a great pleasure to introduce our guest in this lecture, my compatriot, Florencia Rodríguez. Florencia is for me especially a really pleasure if you share with us your experience, your knowledge, and if especially interesting in this specific moment in the history of the not only of about the institute, the history about the production of knowledge related with architectural design, urban design, etc. And in my case, is especially I don't know, it's a very nice experience to receive from you, from your positions in South America, also in USA. How do you see the future about architectural design, and everything related with our topics in our institute. Thank you so much, Florencia. And Laura, please, can you introduce our guest?
Absolutely. Well, it is also a pleasure for me to introduce Florencia because she happens to be also a faculty at Loeb, our master in Spanish at IAAC. So I've had the pleasure to listen to Florencia a couple of times, and I must say that it's, let's say, mind-changing. And I'm sure you all like it very much. So I'd like to read a bit of her curriculum. Florencia Rodríguez is an Argentinian architect and cultural producer. She founded Plot, one of the leading publications in Latin America, and later created Lots of Architecture Publishers, a US-based publishing company focused on design, architecture, and urban culture. Its most significant project has been the periodical publication Ness. Currently, she is a lecturer in architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where she was granted the Loeb Fellowship between 2013 and 2014. Thank you, Florencia, for joining us here today. It's a true pleasure to listen to you again. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that introduction, and thank you, Willy, as well. I'm really glad to be here again and to keep on sharing my experiences and ideas with IAAC. It's always a pleasure. So here we are. So welcome, everybody. For me, it's like 1:30, 1:40 in the afternoon. I know you might be tired. It's later for you, but I'll try to make it kind of, it's going to be intense. I don't know. We'll talk about criticism, and I'll make at the beginning a small introduction. Let me share my screen. Do you see this? Okay, this is okay.
Yes.
Great. So when I was invited, I thought it was interesting to share my work, but only through the lenses of a new publication that I'm working on. Why Bother? A Critical Editorial Manifesto in the Age of Dispersion is the title of the book that I'm working on, that compiles and reviews some of my work, and that includes also new texts and some provocations to discuss about the present and future of design criticism. So parts of this talk are fragments of that book or issues that are addressed there in one way or the other. And I really hope to be able to share the book itself with you next year. I'm in the process of finishing it during 2022. So before I start actually showing my work, I will make a theoretical introduction to let you know what is it that I understand as criticism and what does this idea of dispersion that is in the title mean and imply. So let's dive in, and I hope you can feel related to some of the images and sorry, to some of the ideas, and if not, I'm happy to discuss them. So critique was born in the age of systematization, as many of you know, legitimization and trust in the organizations of facts and knowledge, you know, or an era in modernism that it's clearly understood with system, with canons, and all of that organization of knowledge, as I was mentioning. As a mode of thought, it implied a rational, interpretative relation to the present, making of philosophy and the abstract problematization of existence the defining attitude of the modern being. This attitude was meant to be the alert sign, kind of the B-side of a political and social order, is the denunciative other, no? Enabling a determined kind of relationship to what exists. And here I will quote Foucault, who would say, whatever the pleasures or compensations accompanying this curious activity of critique, it seems that it rather regularly, almost always, brings not only some stiff bit of the utility it claims to have, but also it is supported by some kind of more general imperative, more general still than that of eradicating errors. There is something in critique which is akin to virtue. Though talking about virtue nowadays is not a common thing, criticism is still driven by the possibility of transformation, of making things better. We don't know exactly what would that be, but that's the interesting part. If critics publish, tweet, chat, and exchange ideas in any other public forum, it is because there is some idealism involved, some trust in knowledge and collective evolution, and therefore the need to communicate. On the other side, we all seem to be permanently running to get used to our realities. The speed and reach of the changes we experience, the shift from continuity to iteration, the proliferation of devices and apps, and so many other of the many characteristics that define our existence, constantly confront us with questions about almost every preset concept. Writers such as Baudelaire, Arnold Toynbee, or Marshall Berman have already described the anxiety that modernism, industrialization, and the technology breakthroughs were causing in their times. And our present need to constantly update our lives, much more than at that moment, no? And since 2020, where I don't need to explain a lot about this. Now, the level of changes have become like exponentially more ferocious and demanding in the last decades. So to refresh some facts and only understand them in time, let's understand this. The internet started to be commercialized only in the 90s. In 1997, Google was created. Twitter was presented in 2006, Facebook in 2004, the iPhone or the smartphone in general in 2007, and Wikipedia in 2001. Amazon, and with it an extraordinary transformation of retail, is dated from 1995. And we could go on engrossing this list by Blogspot, WordPress, the iPad, the iWatch, Skype, Spotify, Netflix, and so many things that in the last 30 years have absolutely changed our lives. Our whole relationship with time, space, and our everyday agenda were already subjected to constant change during the last decades. And then, of course, 2020, as I was mentioning, challenged us even more, and Zoom took over our lives. But it is not all about the anxiety and the pressure. All of these creations also brought several good opportunities. I can state with no doubt that less than 30 years ago, my job and all that I have worked on as it exists, as it is, and the way we make our publications were not even possible. Nor even would be this lecture today, no? Some of the matters related to these phenomena were already part of the discussions decades before the internet. Let's just think about the repeated enunciations of the end of history, the end of art, the postmodern debate. what deconstructivism was in a way denunciated by the explosion of language, the metaphorical explosion of language, or the already disaggregated pieces of any fixed and unified form of meaning. Critique was conditioned by a cultural atmosphere, and already in 1978, Foucault, in the same text that I quoted before, that is in fact a lecture, defined it as something inevitably and by nature condemned to dispersion, dependency, and pure heteronomy. Heteronomy instead of autonomy, after those discussions in architectural autonomy. The new vehicles and means of criticism emphasized even more those conditions. These new platforms amplified audiences and demand more and diverse voices and are putting criticism into discussion again, but live and globally. Dispersion and dissolution don't mean disappearance, nor the cease to exist of added values, but on the contrary, more of a spilling, a dissemination, and a redistribution, It is that revolution from a contained universal discourse towards a collectivity, a constellation of the diverse, that I am proposing to reflect on here. Words, images, objects have the power to generate territories. A dispersed body of ideas is like a dispositif, a mutant abstract machine that expands, contracts, and changes depending on interpretations, misunderstandings, evolutions, and the cultural fields in which it interacts. Concepts can become means of deterritorialization. Oh, this in English is hard for me. Deterritorialization. Those new territories don't have a static and a clear form, and some transformations are not immediately evident. They develop in time through conversations, readings, invitations, exchanges, publications, exhibitions, friendships, reviews, and other ordinary acts, though its impact is vital sometimes. So why bother? Or why do we need criticism? We need it not to be governed quite so much, would Foucault say, and I would say also to aim for virtue. A virtue that is made of strata and various interests, let them be social, political, technological, or related to beauty and experience. And for that, we need to distinguish between usability patterns in which ideas could be understood as tools or intellectual entertainment, which I enjoy sometimes, of course, but it's not enough, and utility in a way of serving the cultural production of our time. As it is a characteristic of the dispersed to disaggregate sometimes, it could get confusing and difficult to link things and to make sense. It is important to educate and inform intuition to be able to differentiate. It is important to edit. Another of the contemporary problems of criticism is how do we judge if we don't use the reductive system of good versus bad anymore. And we have to provide a new set of criteria if we are working and thinking in a sort of canon-less era. Its responsibilities, criticism responsibilities, are more related now to pointing out the special characteristics of an architectural or urban act, to be able to compare, to give context, to interrogate its object, to open the analysis to as much theoretical compromises with reality as available, and to make collective and democratic the process of communication and thinking. Critique wants to make evident the possibility of taking active part of the construction of our environment. So we need criticism, not only the criticality of social media, but really to build on understand architectural as a cultural product. So I like to think as myself as an activist, though I don't use neither protest nor denunciative tones in my work generally, what I do is trying to shape ideas in ways that the people first relate easily to them and then participate with a commitment. The possibility for us of criticism today include the traditional writing, exhibition, and symposia, but in infinite formats to be explored that are being rehearsed permanently. So I hope to be able to show you some of this here. Now we will see some images to try to first provoke and understand what I understand as the possibility of making a field through words and through ideas. And for that, I'm using this image that is kind of my fetish image because of certain things that it implies. No, as you can see, this is the man on the moon. No, Neil Armstrong's photograph of Edwin Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon, supposedly in 1969 during the Apollo 11 mission. But it also has other values. No, it's of course the Andy Warhol's characterization and post-production that took this image and organized it into a work of art and put it into a museum. And then the third thing that for me it's interesting is that this was the first time that something was televised alive throughout the world. No, so this changes the idea of communications. Not everybody had TVs at that moment, nor for sure, not in color, but the idea of covering the whole globe with one act that was going on in the moment, and that for us is absolutely common and ordinary nowadays, is really interesting. And I want to keep on that. I want you to keep that idea hanging in your heads. This is a work by Andres Jaque, these rings that he proposed for people to make kind of a commitment, and when they would buy it, they would have to use this as a dispositive, as an object to generate new conversations about ecology and trash, etc. No? So if I would wear one of these rings and I would be in the party and somebody would tell me, oh, what a nice ring or something like that, I would need to start a conversation about what we do with our trash. And that again, with an object, it had the intention of organizing a territorial field that implied some ideas that would be evolving and changing and that wouldn't depend on one emissor, you know. So that idea of field is something that I am very interested in my work. Again, this can be maybe inspired by the idea of the Tupperware and how it was sold, you know, organizing from a house to another house, word to word, and using friendships and relationships that already exist to use this idea of dispersion, dissemination, spilling that I was mentioning before. So with that in mind, it is that I started thinking about the idea of discrete revolutions that I really like, no? Because I very much believe in the impact both of individuals and of a collective, of the small transformations. An action, a publication, a course, a project, a text, a review, and all the things that I was mentioning before can turn things in your immediate context in a different direction, can incite you to think differently, and can affect others. So our world is huge and we are too many, but change starts somewhere always. I'm sure that today, more than ever, we need to reinforce the relationship between critical thinking and design. And lately, in this post-digital era of non-stop scrolling, the fields of architecture, theory, and criticism seem to have been kind of busy, you know, lightheaded or diluted. And I think all the urgent matters that we read about every day are calling for new narratives and new voices. So based on that, is that years after acting as a contributor to other publications. In 2010, I was able to find this opportunity to found Plot and make it public, and build my own editorial project. I had some partners that still keep on working in this ongoing publication, but in a way, I organized the criteria, the editorial criteria for this project. In the first editorial letter for this publication, I stated, Plot is idealistic. It believes in the necessity and the possibility of rekindling arguments. We are motivated to look for meanings, to contribute to the discipline, and propose alternatives to the pragmatic crisis in which criticism has been lately involved. We find richness in the diversity of the global, in what is to be transferred from the sensitivity of the singular, and in the individual values that make better collectives. Our world is huge, complex, and interesting. And then it goes. You will find that we try to show that the most austere architecture has as much to contribute as other spectacular cases, and that we do not believe that any of these can constitute only in themselves a unique criterion or a universal sufficient value. The same thing happens in regards to the formal, the technological, or the philosophical strata. And this sort of short editorial manifesto also claimed for the renewal of the legitimizing apparatuses. The audience at that moment was primarily South American, and the project was so enthusiastically received that in the first 2 years, it grew really fast. One of the things that was striking to me and that made me understood of the value of the work that I was doing, that we were doing as a group, was when walking around in the public University of Buenos Aires, it became very ordinary to see students and faculty like working with the publications and having the copies on their desks, using them as references. Under my direction, Plot made 40 issues, plus a collection of 80 special editions, a couple of books, and a small design magazine that lasted 11 monthly issues, also devoted to design, as I was mentioning. What defined this editorial project and all I have done, this is a bad resolution, sorry. All I have done is that it puts together practice and theory. I understand editing as a critical activity, not just as a way of putting nice things together. We have developed a particular form of editorial research, collaborated with universities, and used the magazine as a platform. In the images, you can have a glimpse of some of the things we covered and different events also that we have organized. But then in this one, for instance, Fideicomiso, that is something developed by Elias Redstone. This is just an example on how comics or drawings were used also as theoretical vehicles or critical vehicles. We participated in many events. We tried to organize series as this one, Otros Mundos Posibles, Other Possible Worlds, that were a series that tried to show in different issues in time certain researches and having a continuity between different publications. So this is Plot. As you can see, there are some architecture details, huge images, because one of our also takes was that images are again a critical vehicle, as I was saying, and we are seeing in this non-stop scrolling that I was mentioning before, all that you see in a printed matter, for sure, you have already seen in ArcDaily or in another screen, you know, but it's not the same to have the time to contemplate an image, to have it in paper, to be able to see different details on it and to then reflect on that. Another thing is that we wanted to put faces to some of the producers to understand what they were thinking, doing, what were the specific contexts of their productions. So it was really it was really a very intentionated publication, you know. Then we started to publish it also in Portuguese and to distribute it in the whole continent. As I was mentioning, plot is still ongoing, directed by Rodrigo Commerce Bender, one dear friend and colleague, and we still contribute very frequently. These are some of the events that we generated. You can see an exhibition in the top left corner that was first organized in Buenos Aires called Post, Post, Post. It was about Ibero-American architecture, and then traveled to Medellin. And in this picture, it is in Uruguay, in Montevideo, in the Universidad de la República. Then with Hernán Díaz Alonso contributing in the Architectural Biennial of Buenos Aires, or with Jiménez Lai, that also uses drawing and comics as a way of criticism and theory, and some events, public events that we did to put people together and to generate conversations. It really made an impact in our immediate context, and it grew beyond our limits. This is at the GSD in 2012, I guess, participating of the South America Project series, which we made an agreement to contribute, and some audiovisual formats that we developed. Clorindo Testa here talking with Ciro Nakle more than 10 years ago. Well, and these are more exhibitions that we took part of. But what I want to show is like the amount of things and how a media in this moment is more a platform that only one journal, one publication in itself delimits the idea of the field that I was mentioning, of having conversations, of spreading the voice, and also not spreading the voice in the terms that you have a closed message that you want to let the others know, but to start a conversation and open a live conversation that would transform the ideas and that will expand and participate in our cultural field. This is also part of the of one symposia that I did at the GSD. Because of the experiences that I've had and the impact that plot had, I was invited to be a Loeb Fellow at the GSD in between 2013 and 14. And my independent research at that moment was particularly organized through this symposia, What Criticism? We discussed about the impossibility of criticism in a way. We discussed about different scenarios and situations. There is another version of me with darker hair and pregnant in that photograph with dear friends Ulchi Grau, Jiménez Lai, Camilo Restrepo, Uriel Fogué, Meredith Tenor, Iker Gil, and many people that really committed to this discussion. After some years, I went back to Buenos Aires, and again, believing in the idea of discrete revolutions that I was mentioning and the impact that space can have, Pablo Gerson and I opened Monte, that it was a space that we knew from the beginning that would last only a couple of years while we were working in this space and waiting for it to be developed. I will just play a very short video to show you, to show you which was the spirit of what was going on there. It's very short. We made workshops, we collaborated with different institutions again. We had like international guests, other very local, discussing about Buenos Aires, Marcelo Faiden, Alessandra Borassi, Giovanna Borassi, sorry, many people contributing to think about architecture, design, landscape, that is maybe something that we thought that needed to be kind of more open in Buenos Aires particularly, etc. In this same space, we did some other research practices and participated as a hub for the Polar Lab, organized in the AEA by Giulia Foscari, and generated a year of a series of different approaches to what was going on in Antarctica. That ended up being a huge book edited by Giulia Foscari and her office, Unless. And well, there we also started the project of NES, that I would say for me, it means like an evolution of plot in a way. This was the first issue. We decided to start this publication in English because when we travel around with plot and because of the fellowship that I had in the US and everything, we understand that this idea of putting together practice and theory, practice and words and things, wasn't as usual as maybe we think or we feel in the European or Latin American tradition. We're more used to publications as Domus, Casabella, or many of the Spanish publications as Arquitectura Viva or the Quaderns, or so many other that really try to deal with that. But it was interesting to start like bringing that mode of understanding architecture criticism to the English language and expanding our reach in terms of also not only of the audience, but also of the people that we could talk to. So these were the first two issues, NES and NES Docs. NES Docs is a monographic series. We have only done 2 of those and 3 issues of NES. NES comes out when we are able to. It's a much more smaller publishing company than it was with Plot, but it has these dossiers that are between cozy history and homey techniques in the first issue, Mad World pictures in the second one, and what's an object in the third one. In each of those cases, we have explored kind of different formats. In the first one, in between cozy history and homey techniques, we invited some people to just grab their phone, invite somebody else, and record very informally 20 minutes conversations about what this title would trigger. Of course, we were saying that architecture was going like in different directions, and that history, it was in the same year than the Chicago Biennial with the title Make New History, and when we all had again a fresh memory of the fundamentals, Venice Biennial by Kohlhaas. So history was kind of, as I would say, a place to make sure that you were in a safe place, and then the techniques, another aspect of it. And we were asking if there wasn't a space in between or some other place for the discipline to understand, to look for new narratives. And with that in mind, we asked a lot of people to start talking, and we had an amazing series of conversations. Stan Allen with Jesus Basayo, Enrique Ramirez with Mimi Zeiger, Emmanuel Kreis with Camilo Restrepo, and I spoke with Sharon Johnston, more related to the biennial theme. Then in the second one, we decided to go to another scale and to talk about the city, the world, globalization, the idea of mapping and understanding different situations regarding our world and existence today. And here again, the formats were more free. There are some more typical interviews or essays, but then we had this idea of making kind of a game in which there were some agents and they had to think together about something. I have to say that some people are very open to be invited to these new formats, but sometimes it feels kind of overwhelming, and it's interesting to deal with that. In this issue, I also had an amazing email conversation with the late Jean-Luc Nancy, and it was interesting to have to use something as ordinary as the email to communicate, in different weeks and start thinking and have the time to read an answer, translate it, for sure misunderstand something in the process, try to re-question and have this. He was really generous and I really liked that interview. And the last issue, What's an Object, had again another kind of research of new formats. We made a series of drawings. I think I have some images of all of this. A series of drawings in which the buildings were impersonated and we give them a voice. So while this is like the editorial text of the first issue, that, well, I can share with you in another moment, but this is kind of the tone of the publication, some of the table of contents of the issues, but I wanted to show you kind of the spirit, the atmosphere, and some of the drawings that we generated. What's an Object? I interviewed Timothy Morton also, and these are the reenactments and the production that the team made also to participate. So again, what is criticism? What are the means? What is the kind of editorial research that a publication that ours can do? What is the role of the printed matter nowadays? Are things that kind of obsessed my practice and that I have been working on. This is another research that we did that was kind of 40 pages in the first issue on Detroit and the transformation. I went to Detroit the year before and I was kind of really surprised seeing the modern ruins, not modern, like postmodern ruins of a city that was like the image of the future, like only 80 years ago, and then went into bankruptcy. It's super interesting to understand that idea of the 20th century, of mid-century, and why it failed. And for that, we had like historical approaches. We made these infographics, we talked to politics, we talked to architecture practices, we generated this visual essay by Pablo Gerson, my partner, who is a photographer as well. And we tried to put together lots of different formats and outcomes of research like this one. And like that, we did in other issues. Then, of course, we show practices in a more traditional way, but again, we try to have always interviews, conversations, and to give the images that space that I was mentioning as an opportunity of reflection, and not only as, architecture porn, I would say. These are, again, some images of the issues. And these are some books that we have been doing for the Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, IDB in English, about architecture and cities, particularly in Latin America. So we have some of these are, most of these are downloadable online and are available for free, and you can find them in their site. And these are my last publications, just to give you kind of a general picture of what I have been working on. In 2021, this issue was finally printed. I co-edited this issue of the Harvard Design Magazine with Mark Lee. We were invited to do so in 2019. And we decided at that moment to talk about America, and being Latin American and talk about America and always only implying the US is, of course, a provocation. It's a big discussion, and it is addressed in some of the articles. But I thought, and we thought together, that this was, as the text says there, a pivotal moment, that this idea, the American dream, was kind of in the verge of failure in many aspects. Remember, we are thinking of a country at that moment whose president was Trump, and with lots of crises. And of course, in the process, in the editorial process, we went through 2020, so it got stuck for some months, and many things happened. Of course, the Black Lives Matter, COVID, all the situations that emerged from that like pointed out and make more evident kind of the inequity issues, poverty, density, and problems in different aspects of that implied the need for architecture criticism and urbanism to think about. So this magazine saw the light after that in 21, and I think it's an interesting publication still. This is my latest book. It has just been presented in March this year. This is a cooperation with IIT, ACTAR, and NES. In 2016, I was part of the jury of this prize, the MCHAP prize. MCHAP is the Mies Crown Hall Americas Prize, organized by IIT, that looks at the architecture in the Americas. As the Americas, as a set of relations, is one of the main, the predominant subjects of my research in time in the last, I would say, almost 20 years in different situations. I was invited to be a juror, and I participated in this. And then I was invited to be the guest editor for the second edition for the second book related to this cycle. And I decided to talk about territory and expeditions and the trip as a way of researching, of understanding differences, and to put together lots of texts by amazing contributors and projects. I'm working now. I'm sorry, the resolution is, I see it okay in my other screen. I'm not sure why it lost resolution in some of the images that I'm showing. And this is a book that I am working on also right now. It's about to be finished, and I hope to be able to print it. This is New Latin American Design, and it puts together around 20 designers of Latin America, and focusing on the production modes and the differentiation in between that and the rest of the world. So just like going back to the idea of way better, as you can see, I suffer from optimism. Like the world is complex, as I was saying, it's huge, but I think that I really believe in the power of these discrete revolutions that I was mentioning, of advocating for some ideas, of participating, of putting together people, gathering and organizing collective situations to transform what we are living. So I feel also the responsibility when I am like conducting a media or teaching or participating in a conference, to try to do something in that sense. So I want to finish with a small manifesto that I was invited to do at the storefront for that exhibition that I showed like very quickly of publications that was called Arquine. And they invited me to participate in a panel called Crisis, because of course I'm from Argentina, I'm from Latin America, so I had to be in the one called Crisis. So I started with this beautiful crisis, because I think, of course, crisis is not always beautiful, but I just wanted to play with it, with idea, and try to show that in crisis, I had always tried to find opportunities to work and to transform and to do stuff. So I started with this beautiful crisis. Desire is something that moved my editorial practices, so it's important to have that desire to change, to make it happen, to do it yourself and to do it with others, to be open to change, to assume responsibilities, to question, to tend to objectivity, but to trust subjectivity as well. So that was my editorial manifesto at that time. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to talk if you want.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Florencia. Always inspiring and, let's say, groundbreaking ideas. It's always a pleasure for me to be able to listen to you. And we would like to pass the word to the students and guests today. If anyone has a question, Florencia, I saw that someone raised a hand, but I don't see it anymore. I'm not sure if, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
How are you?
Yes.
I lowered my hand, but thank you so much for the lecture and sharing those nice images, as well as the commentary. My question is maybe a little bit weird, so bear with me, but it's something that I've been trying to wrap my head around, having to do with the criticism of architecture. Mm-hmm. It seems, and I'll preface this by the fact that I'm not an architect at all. My background is in development. Mm-hmm. And it seems like when a building is built that is loved in an architectural sense right away by the community that it's built in, it's sort of heralded as an example of great architecture, right? And people say, wow, this is amazing. It makes the community better. We love the architecture. We want more of this, right? And when a building is constructed that is architecturally unpopular from the outset, typically the conversation is actually more around like the evil of the developer, and what a victim our community is from this development, right? Like we need less of developers who are going to do things like this. But then what seems super interesting to me about this is that over time, a lot of architecture that initially was very unpopular becomes popular with time. Like some of the most beloved examples of architecture are things that when they were initially built were super unpopular. And yet when those things then become popular later, it's again praise of the architecture, but there's never recognition that was at one point a development and a developer was involved. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around how and why the criticism of architecture is always in favor of the architect in the long term, and that there's no recognition that it requires the act of development as well, and that the act of development is often vilified in the form of buildings that are not appreciated right away. I don't know if that even really makes sense, but it's a problem I'm trying to wrap my head around. If it maybe gives you something to speak on.
Okay, thank you for the question, Ocean. No, I think that you're pointing out something that is very complex and that doesn't have like a very short answer. It has a reflection, and of course there is this huge contradiction in between what architects like, what the community is like, and what developers want. And these are conditioned also by capitalism, by the value of the land, by lots of things. And I think we have like different aspects of this problematic. In one way, I would say, when you started talking, I was thinking of a student of mine that, like, I think it was 15 years ago, and she was an older student. She was like starting as a second career late in life, architecture. So she was maybe more comfortable she felt more comfortable asking certain questions than the rest. And at the end of the first year, she looked at me and she said, would you tell me when will I start liking the Ville Savoye, for instance? And it's like, we have like this taste that is formed, that is educated in a way, and that sometimes is not the same than the rest of the community. It's really funny when you see in Argentina, there is this newspaper that has an architecture section, and each year they make like this encuesta. How do you say encuesta?
Survey.
The survey, thank you, Laura. The survey, the people, your most favorite building, or the one that you dislike the most. And sometimes it is the same one, because people, like, It's like the Biblioteca Nacional done by Florindo Testa, that is a brutalist, magnificent piece of architecture that we architects love, but people hate. So there is this kind of separation in what taste means in general that was part of what modernism made. In fact, it's interesting. There is this book from Thomas Wolfe that the translation in Spanish was Quien teme al Bauhaus feroz, but I don't remember the original title in English. Is not like that, but I can search it and send it to Laura if you're interested in. That said, that modernism was kind of the moment in which the general taste, the public and the architects were kind of torn apart in a way. And that's something that impacts in the problems that you were pointing out. And of course, developers, again, it's like have their similar understanding of things. And sometimes you are into developing, but I think you can probably agree to think that many developers are denying certain aspects of what urbanity means or some quality of life, and sometimes that made them being like misjudged or judged in a negative, with a negative connotation. But I have seen in the last 2 decades, particularly, many developers trying to think about the city in a very interesting way, understanding what does it lead to, or what does it mean to organize a community, what gives value to the city, understanding the need to have some diversity and integration in the city, understanding the need to incorporate nature in the developments. So I think things are changing, and that we need criticism also to point out those things. So, and for that, we need more of the critics that are working like publicly in the newspapers and talking to the general audience and interviewing developers and decision makers and architects, and to put together all those different voices. Maybe that's the conclusion. Sorry, it was a very long answer because the question was more sort of a reflection than a question in itself. But I think that the solution or something similar to an answer there is related to put together in the same table different people to talk.
Yeah, thank you for those reflections. It was certainly exactly like you said, a reflection and not exactly a question. It just seems perhaps that criticism cuts both ways, positive and negative in the architectural sense, and often only cuts negatively in the development sense. And to maybe build a conversation around also lifting up and praising development that's a positive influence on our cities. So thank you for your thoughts.
Does anyone else have a question? For now, no, let me check. Yes. Well, so I guess we can wrap it up. Thank you once again, Florencia. It was a pleasure. And we will see more of you in our MOIC classes next year. And we keep in touch. Thanks everyone for coming today for the lecture as well. And see you around.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks, take care.